Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning from wherever you're joining us from today. My name's Sarah and I'm the Program and Event Manager at the Reactor in Sydney, Australia. Welcome to a Microsoft Reactor Sydney live stream event. Today I would like to welcome back Fabio Braga. So Fabio is a Chief Architect at Microsoft with more than 20 years of experience in Microsoft data solutions. His passion for data architecture led him to design and implement mission-critical solutions in large and complex environments such as healthcare providers, government departments, water and energy companies, superannuation and finance organizations. So today he will be talking about enterprise scale analytics with you. You'll all see that just a bit of housekeeping, I have put into the comments section the check-in link. Fabio has kindly provided some links from his session today, so you'll be able to find them by entering in the AKA link into your web browser and then entering the code 14557. So Fabio will be speaking for about 45 minutes and we'll take about 10 minutes for questions at the end if you have any. However, do send us your questions throughout and we will try and answer as many as possible. At the conclusion, we'll also share with you a link to our feedback survey with the same code 14557. And if you have time to fill that out, it would be great. And this will also, so if there's anything that you've missed from today's session, the on-demand version will be available straight after today on our YouTube channel, which we'll also share with you the link to. But for now, I'd like to hand the floor over to Fabio to begin. So thank you so much, Fabio, and over to you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sarah. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are watching for us. Thank you very much for joining. I'm Fabio Braga. I'm a Chief Architect at Microsoft Australia. And today we're going to have an architectural conversation about enterprise scale analytics, right? Let me set the context here of what's going to be the talk of today. So very often we hear from customers in every conversation that we have, some of them say, hey, how do we do cloud properly? And this question comes not only from customers who are in the beginning of their cloud journey. We are also seeing customers who have a certain level of maturity. They started the adoption of cloud a few years ago in a more kind of organic way, tipping their toes in the cloud by provisioning some VMs. And suddenly they saw their cloud environment growing into PaaS services and more SaaS offers. And now they are kind of at the point of, hey, let's review what we're doing and see if we're doing this in the right way so we can actually harvest all of these benefits that cloud provides. So if we take this question and we actually go to the next level of details, is hey, how do I do Azure specifically in the right way? How should I organize my Azure environment to allow me to have a good operational model and have a way to harvest all of these benefits of agility that cloud provides? And of course, the topic of the conversation that we're going to have today is going to be even more specific, is how do I do analytics in Azure in the right way, which is exactly the topic of we're going to discuss with enterprise scale analytics. Before I go and deep dive into enterprise scale analytics, let me spend the next 5 to 10 minutes talking about some of the fundamental concepts that will help me with the enterprise scale analytics explanation later on, right? So to answer this question in terms of how to do cloud properly, how to do it the right way, and how to do Azure analytics the right way, allow me to introduce you some of the concepts. And here, let's talk about the how organizations need to think about that. The answer to this question around how to do things properly is not just about technology, right? So if we put on the line, right, control on one side and agility and speed and results on the other side, you have to agree and land somewhere between these two extremes. Right? Sometimes you can't go all the way over control and you can't go all the way to agility. You have to measure where you feel comfortable in your journey to the cloud in terms of giving users the agility of the cloud without letting go of the control in terms of security and compliance of your environment, right? And as I mentioned, the answer to this question is all about people, process, and technology. Technology by itself is not going to help you. You need to organize yourselves your teams and your functions and establish process between them that will modernize your environment. I still see customers out there that have done a lift and shift of their processes to the cloud. They're still following the same procurement processes that they used to get, for example, to order storage for on-premises, right? So get a procurement, get an RFI, and place an order and wait for 6 months for the storage array to arrive and assembling in the rack. Usually a process that takes kind of 6 months. They're still following the same kind of procurement and approval processes to provision a storage account in Azure, right? So it's clear that it's not just about technology. You have to improve and modernize your processes and how people operate around them as well, right? And we have some guidance around that. I'm not sure if you guys have ever heard of this before, but the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework, as we call it, CAF, is our guidance in terms of how you should organize your organization around cloud. That inside this plan, we have this kind of these different stages of your implementation plan for your cloud journey, to the way you define the strategy, you plan in terms of what you want to do, you want to get ready to onboard your first workloads, and then when you start adopting and migrate and innovate and start using more cloud native features, and the ability to govern and manage your workloads in the cloud. I highly recommend you guys have a look at the Cloud Adoption Framework because it is our guidance in terms of how you should do things properly. If you haven't seen the Cloud Adoption Framework, this is what it looks like, right? There is a number of tools and templates that you can use to help with your cloud journey. And for each one of these phases of the Cloud Adoption Framework, there is a whole bunch of documentation and guidance in terms of what it means. For example, I mentioned people as one of the pillars to do things properly using cloud. When you go to the organize phase here of the CAF, we can click on the organization alignment and you can see that, hey, we have some functions that we understand are required or important to have as part of your cloud team, right? And then as you organize people in organizations, let's put it that way, you have the ability to create your centers of excellence and the cloud adoption functions, the cloud adoption teams. There's a number of ways where you can organize yourselves around these functions to do things in the right way as we expect in the CAF, right? So highly recommend you, if you haven't seen much of the CAF yet, please spend the time to look at that. Part of the Cloud Adoption Framework actually comes very kind of attached to this is the WellArchitected Framework, right? It's a subset of the Cloud Adoption Framework, which is the definition of these 5 pillars that encompass the recommendation and guidance for you to follow when you deploy cloud workloads. And here we're talking about cost optimization, operational excellence, performance and efficiency, reliability and security, right? So these 5 pillars, if you drill down into the details of each one of these pillars, you'll find prescriptive guidance in terms of how do I deploy cost-effective workloads in Azure, right? There's a number of best practices, things like make sure that in your dev environments you turn off the VMs when they're not needed, overnight or over the weekends, right? In terms of security, make sure that you use policies to enforce the configuration, the correct configuration for services. For operational excellence, make sure you actually keep an eye on monitoring and you have a good level of automation and use infrastructure as a code to standardize your environments. So when you go through these 5 pillars of the WellArchitected Framework, you learn what's going to be required and incorporate that as part of the development process for any new workloads. We have a number of assessments that are part of the WellArchitected Framework that you can actually assess your existing workloads. You can go through a number of questions that you can answer regarding your workload. And at the end of your assessment, we're going to give you some very useful recommendations to improve the overall quality score of your architecture in Azure based on the best practices that each one of these 5 pillars define. So highly recommend that you have a look at the WellArchitected Framework. The WAF looks like this, right? So I have the WellArchitected Framework here in the 5 pillars. There is a very good playlist of videos available on YouTube around the WellArchitected Framework in terms of the detailed explanation of every one of the pillars. And this is what the assessments that I mentioned to you look like. You go through an assessment, you choose your interests, and you go through a number of questions, and you give exactly, it's going to give you a recommendation of what you should do to improve the score, right? So again, that's another principle that's going to help us with the enterprise scale analytics, because what we're going to see later follow these 5 principles. It's important for you to be familiar with them. Right? Moving on. When you get ready in your cloud journey to deploy workloads in the cloud, there is a section of the cloud adoption framework, which is the ready section, right? And in that ready section, it gives, okay, how should I organize my Azure environment so we can have scalability of my solutions? How can I empower my cloud adoption teams, my business units, so they can have their own, let's say, subscriptions, so they can deploy workloads, and at the same time, I can go to bed, sleep in peace, knowing that everything is still compliant and everything is still secure. So part of the ready phase of the CAF, we define the concept of enterprise scale landing zones, right? We see this architecture here on the screen. Apologies. But that's our prescriptive guidance in terms of how you should organize your Azure resources in a way that you can scale and maintain security and compliance. So just super quickly here to explore enterprise scale landing zones, it's not only an architectural guidance, you actually have some artifacts that can help you deploy these structures, right? So it's not vaporware. We have a GitHub repo with a deploy to Azure button. I'll show you in a second, that can help you deploy a structure like this. And the whole principle of enterprise scale landing zones is a concept called the subscription democratization, right? So let me quickly walk you through here. You have the concept of management groups, where you can create your hierarchy that represents how your workloads are organized. And you have a number of subscriptions that play specific functions. For example, here we have your identity subscription, which is contain all of your identity related resources, domain controllers, and monitoring and capabilities, right? So everything related to identity management belongs to their own subscription. And here you have the ability, for example, to delegate the management of the subscription to the group that plays that role in the organization to manage identity. You have another subscription here, which is the management subscription, where we keep all of your automation, all your monitoring resources. And again, segregation of duties, you can delegate the administration to another group responsible for that. You have the connectivity subscription, which is the networking components that connect back to on-premises and has a way out to the internet. And you have your hub network, for example. And again, you can actually have the delegation of administration of the subscription to the networking team. And each workload that you deploy, every time that you have a new workload, it can have its own dedicated subscription, right? If this workload needs connectivity back to on-premises or to the internet, for example, you can do a VNet connection, a VNet peering between these networks, but each workload has its own subscription. And these subscriptions, they will suffer the effects of these policies that you put in place. So once you define these policies for your landing zones, you'll be sure that, for example, if you don't want any public IP addresses to be provisioned, a policy will enforce that. And no one in a landing zone, for example, will be able to provision a public IP address, right? So that's a kind of a principle of how you enforce that. So when you go to the GitHub repo, if you search GitHub for enterprise scale, you find that reference implementation of GitHub. It's fully open source. All of the templates are there if you want to take them and customize them. Just fork from this repo and you have the ability to customize what you want. But down here, you have the ability to use one of the existing templates, for example, that just to accelerate your deployment, and click deploy to Azure to create all of this structure for you, right? Then another important concept that we're going to discuss today as part of enterprise scale analytics is what we've been talking about is the analytics continuum, right? So more specifically around the topic of the conversation today, you want to make sure that you're going to have a platform available to you that can cover a wide range of data workloads, right? We're talking about IoT workloads. We're talking about streaming. We're talking about operational reporting, operational databases to support your applications, analytics workloads, data enrichment with custom machine learning models, or even with pre-built machine learning models that can mimic human cognitive services, right? We're talking about how can we have the most comprehensive data platform available that can fulfill the requirements of my use cases and at the same time meet the most common enterprise requirements that any organization has to go through, right? If you look at the bottom here in terms of security and privacy, governance and compliance, availability and recovery, performance and scalability, skills and training, license and usage, and oversight and monitoring, these are 7 pillars of enterprise requirements that no organizations can run away from. You have to make sure that you meet all of these requirements. And depending on the stack of technology that you choose and the data architecture that you put in place, some of these requirements may become harder or easier to be implemented and the requirements should be met, right? So of course that we're going to talk about the Azure data platform here as having the ability to cover you from operational workloads, database to support your applications, all the way to big data storage, big data processing, and AI enrichment, and also the ability to serve data and share with organizations and visualize data and explore data for the purpose of analytics. So when you talk about the analytics continuum, I'm talking about the full spectrum of analytics workloads and how Azure has a place for each one of them, right? Right. I think it's enough of talking about concepts that will be required. Let's go and talk about actually the topic of today, right? Enterprise scale analytics and AI. So what is this? What is this? You guys heard just, as I mentioned before, I just explained to you the concept of enterprise scale landing zones as a way to organize your Azure resources in a way you can grow the number of workloads and still have the ability to delegate power to business units for them to harvest the benefits of the cloud, of the agility, while still maintain control over compliance and security, right? So on top of that concept of enterprise scale landing zones, enterprise scale analytics and AI is actually a framework designed for you to do analytics workloads in a similar fashion, having the ability, for example, to delegate access to the business where they can, for example, implement their own analytics workloads if that's what you want to do, while maintaining control over compliance and security, right? So what we're going to discuss today in terms of enterprise scale analytics is our prescriptive guidance in terms of how you should organize your Azure resources, how you should organize your subscriptions, resource groups, and what kind of resources should be in place to support multiple topologies, from centralized topologies or to agile kind of topologies, data-centric, data lakehouse, or even as we hear more and more people talking about data fabric and data mesh, right? So if we want to go with data mesh, and here, for example, I'm not suggesting that this is the way to go. I'm just saying that if you find that data mesh is the right path for your organization, we have a prescriptive guidance in terms of how you should implement that, right? And that, which is exactly what lacks sometimes when you hear about data mesh is about concepts, but here we're talking about how you can implement that. It was built based on inputs from different places, based on experience that we've had with many organizations, medium and large organizations. And we're trying to automate and pre-build as much as we can from that perspective, with only require minimal customization based on that, right? So, apologies. The prescriptive, this enterprise scale construction set is actually, again, it's a template, is an architectural guidance and a template that can help you accelerate the deployment of these analytics workloads, right? So it has been proven, it's prescriptive. As I said, if we go to the documentation where we define the architectural approach, you see that there is a very vast documentation around how you should organize people and teams to support analytics, how you should actually organize your resources, and the templates to accelerate that, and following the principles that we discussed, for example, using the WellArchitected Framework, cost optimization, monitoring, operational excellence, security, performance scalability, right? The foundation is built on top of the enterprise scale landing zones in terms of that construct of subscriptions. Let's see exactly what that looks like in a second. But the whole idea, the concepts that we're going to discuss here today, the goals will be to allow you to scale your environment without increasing the complexity of managing that kind of growing environment, to self-serve, following the best practices of our architecture framework, support kind of hybrid environments in terms of on-prem and multi-cloud. It is vendor and product agnostic, right? So there are parts of this architecture construct that do not presume that we're going to use Azure services for everything. So there's a place, for example, that you can bring third-party services to complement your strategy, right? And it's part of the CAF strategy, right? So the whole idea of the conversation today is to bring your attention that this is part of a much bigger strategy to advise our customers how to do things in the right way, following the guidance of the cloud adoption framework, right? Let's talk about some of the principles that we have available in the enterprise scale landing zones, right? So two constructs that we're going to see as we dive into the architecture. One is that there will be a concept of a data management landing zone, right? A data management landing zone is where you centralize all of the common components across all of the analytics workloads, right? For example, the data catalog that you're going to use. Let's say if you're using Azure Purview lives in that data management landing zone. Any other automation constructs that you have, for example, across multiple workloads, that's where they live as well, in the data management landing zone. And every analytics workloads that you want to stand up that belongs to different parts of the business, for example, if that's what you want to do, it becomes a data landing zone, right? If you start actually using the concepts of data mesh here, we're talking about actually the concepts of data products, right? Each data product becomes a data landing zone for that. We also define the teams responsible for these analytics and data integrations in the products for each landing zone. And you don't need to have many of those, right? Even though the construct says that you can have one data management landing zone and multiple data landing zones, you don't have to go with many. You can start small. You can start with one landing zone. If your model is to have a centralized environment, that's all you need. Right? You need one data landing zone where you can keep all your environment. But if you want to grow from there, you have the ability to scale and add more landing zones from there, right? Let's talk about a little bit on what's inside the data management landing zone. As I mentioned, you need one of those, right? And the templates will help you deploy a data management landing zone. So all of the governance components for data discovery, contracts, quality, master data, right? The privacy, it's all part of the governance disciplines. They will live in that data management landing zone subscription, which is only one that you need. As I mentioned, all of the automation and networking and container registry, all of the shared resources across these different kind of analytics workloads will also live in that one management landing zone. When we go into the data landing zone, which is where the actual workloads will live, we have the concept of data products, right? If we're talking about data products here, we're talking about a set of artifacts that fulfill a specific need of a business unit, right? You may need, for example, a data warehouse. You may need a kind of a data lake. You may need a data lake house and some reporting capability and some data integration capability to ingest data from sources. So if you get this collection of resources that fulfill the needs of one specific domain, that's what we call a data product, right? As I said, you can have one of those. You start small, you can have one, but you can grow to have many of those data products through many kind of these data landing zones. You have the data integration teams as well, data integration components of the architecture, right? So every single landing zone, if it needs to ingest data from sources, you need some data integration components present as part of the architecture, right? And the guidance also defines that there is a data integration team that will be responsible for reading from the data sources, and they know these data sources really, really well, and how to populate each one of these data products from these data sources, right? These data integrations can be done as batch integrations, right, on a regular cadence, or even as streaming ingestion of data integration points. Right. And of course, at the core of a data landing zone, you have the actual services that make up the data workload. You have kind of polyglot persistence layer and compute that will give you the freedom to implement many different types of analytics use cases, right? Networking components that will allow you to link back to your on-premises network if you need to ingest data from an on-premise system, right? They will all be there. Data lake, metadata services, shared products will all be there as part of that. Important to notice that each one of these data landing zones, if you look at the right-hand side, there is a green arrow kind of running across all of these three components. It's infrastructure as code, right? Very important that your data products, your data landing zones, they can be defined, and they should be defined as templates through code and be under source control, right? So once you, for example, can use some of the existing templates and make some adjustments, and you place that under source control, whenever you need to provision a new data landing zone, you start from that template and you apply the right level of customizations and you save that. If you need to deploy that multiple times, it can be a reusable pattern that will give you the consistency required to have the ability to move code through different environments, for example, right? So infrastructure as a code and the use of ARM templates or bicep scripts or even Terraform templates, if you want, it becomes fundamental as part of this concept. Let's talk about actually starting small, right? So as I mentioned before, when you look at the enterprise scale analytics constructs, right? So you end up with one subscription or one resource group that will contain all of your data management capabilities, all of those shared components that I mentioned before. Usually, many organizations still follow this pattern of having a centralized infrastructure for workloads. That has been working really well for many organizations with small to medium-sized or even large corporations, right? So we start with one data landing zone, which will have all of the artifacts responsible for the implementation of the ingestion and serving data to provide insights for the business from that perspective. So you see that inside the data landing zone, you have data lakes, you have Synapse, you have Data Factory, you have many of the fundamental services that we have available in our Azure data platform to implement this wide range of analytics workloads, right? From there, if you feel that you need more of those, it becomes a matter of extending this concept of landing zones, right? Where you started with that kind of one landing zone, you now have the ability to create multiple of those to meet specific requirements of different business units if you want to, right? The important thing to consider here is how we are going to implement the integration and connectivity between these multiple landing zones, right? So the pattern defines that each one of these data landing zones, they connect to each other through VNet peering, so they can have access to the data created by these organizations. So for example, if we have a landing zone for the marketing department, and they're the ones who define a customer entity, right? So they're the guardians and the stewards of customer data, right? And now we have, let's say, the finance department who has their own landing zone that they want to consume data about customers, right? So it's important that they have the right connectivity, and it's important to know that the integration between services will work really well, right? So here, if you look at this picture, of course, here we are kind of going towards kind of the concept of a mesh where multiple landing zones. It's important that you have a uniform and consistent architecture with standardized services that are known to talk to each other, so you can have the right level of integration. So you can have the right level of maintenance and uniform governance to apply on top of those, right? So that is the option 2 in terms of what it means to have multiple landing zones following the enterprise scale analytics, right? There you go. That's a diagram of an architecture showing putting everything together, right? So let me get my laser pointer here, right? We have here on the data management landing zone, right? So this is this box here, this big box, right? We have all of the shared components that will help you to implement these workloads. You see that we have networking components, automation components down here. We have the monitoring components as well, right? Data catalog and governance becomes kind of a shared component to be reused as well, right? Every data product that you deploy in a data landing zone should talk to the same data catalog that you have here. Any new data service, any new data landing zones, you should automatically register new data sources and new data artifacts in that one centralized data catalog per Azure Purview, let's put it that way. So you have visibility of what's happening across your organization, across these multiple landing zones, right? And then here you have a one-to-many relationship between a data management landing zone and multiple landing zones here. And they have the connectivity through VNet peering to this architecture, right? And then you have the different roles that play in the architecture here as well. Right. Let me show you a bit of the documentation that we've been talking about, right? So I showed you what we had before. If you go to aka.ms/adopt/data management, right, you find this Azure data management and analytics scenario, right? And this is that guidance that I've been talking about, right? It is about preparing your environment, how the landing zones will help you do that. You can scale from there, some design considerations in terms of what it means to manage identity, networking topology. And when you go in and provide governance to your data state, what are components needed for data governance? There will be some guidance there. Data sharing agreements, how to manage those. Security, what are the options for authentication, authorization, privacy? How do I enforce privacy in there, right? How do I organize people and teams? We're going to talk about this in a second, right? It's all different teams functions that play a role inside a data management, enterprise scale analytics, data management and data landing zones, right? And when you go about the architectures here, we have the ability to say, okay, what a data management landing zone looks like. That's the picture I just showed you before, right? And when you go to best practices, there's a number of guidance in terms of, hey, how do I design my data lake zones, right? How many storage accounts should I have? We have the concepts of, hey, we should have 3 data lakes and the role zone, and how we should organize file names and folders. All of the guidance for you to do analytics is described in this documentation. That's why I highly recommend you that you take the time to go over this extensive documentation that we have here. It's a lot to cover in an hour, right? But make sure that you actually visit the website, visit the documentation, and read about it, right? Let's go over super quick around the following elements of enterprise scale landing zone, so you know more about what's included in that package, in that documentation. So just to entice your curiosity to go and look in terms of what's available there. We have an operational model that defines in terms of what are the most important roles that should be involved in an enterprise scale analytics setup, right? So we have the platform group that defines exactly the shared components of the platform, right? So the data platform ops team, for example, will be the ones responsible for maintaining that data governance, data management landing zone, right? And there is also the need for the data landing zone ops team, which is the team responsible for provisioning new data landing zones and customizing it to meet the requirements of business units, right? So this platform ops at the bottom here is the entire cloud as a whole, Azure as a whole platform team, so that these guys manage the connectivity back to on-premises, identity, and everything. Data platform ops is a more focus on the data management side of the platform. And inside each one of the data landing zones, we have the different groups of, we have the integration ops teams, in terms of these are the guys responsible for the ingestion and manipulation and transformation and enrichment of data pipelines. And we have the data product teams, so the team that will be actually developing the data artifacts and using the Azure services that will collect the data that has been ingested and create the artifacts that will finally be consumed by business users at the end, right? So the documentation and the description of these roles is available in the documentation there. So just have a quick look in terms of what these roles mean and how you're going to either split your organization or join these functions together in terms of what it means. But these are functions that we believe are really important to the organization there, right? In terms of automation, right? So of course that we want to, this whole process to be scalable, right? So you have a representation here in terms of what is a data landing zone, but how can I allow the business to be more autonomous, let's put it that way, in requesting a new data landing zone, right? Part of the constructs of the enterprise analytics, we have already put the pipelines in place, the GitHub pipeline, the Azure DevOps pipelines already in place to allow the provisioning and the automation of new data landing zones with the right policies in place, right? So of course you can customize all of that, but you don't start from the scratch. So here, a potential workflow could be a data product team in the business uses a portal. It can be, I don't know, maybe you have ServiceNow or any other internal portal that they can place a request. And that can trigger a workflow in Azure DevOps that will ask for approval for the data management team. Say, hey, there's a new request for a new data landing zone here. If this is approved, I will go through the pipelines to deploy, to fork a new data landing zone from the repository, make the necessary customizations, and finally deploy all of those artifacts with the right policies and the right permissions in place for you to start using, right? So all of this guidance, again, in terms of how to automate this process is fully described as part of the enterprise scale analytics construct documentation, right? Pay attention to that, have a quick read, There's some very good guides in terms of how you can make all of this fully automatic with minimal intervention to create new data products for the team. Okay. And finally, the concept of data products, right? Each one of these data products, we have to identify exactly what those are in the business. If we're going with a central data product that's going to serve the entire organization, or if you're going with a distributed development kind of nature, it is important to understand exactly who those are and what defines them. So what are the inputs and outputs and constraints that you can have in each one of these data products. And of course, more important, the governance and the people responsible for maintaining that data product, right? So the governance becomes something critical when you work in a distributed way, right? But in terms of the guidance for technology, you have this ability, as I mentioned before, to have, if you want to go that way, to have a kind of a federated way to distribute your environment, right? One way to define these data products is, let's say, by business units and by topics, by solution domains. You decide exactly what's the best way to go. But the thing is, each one of these data products should be able to talk to each other, and it should be able to be defined as infrastructure as a code. So you can have a template, a reusable template for that, right? So a data product will have, as I mentioned before, they have the inputs and the outputs. You expose these outputs. It can be APIs, it can be files that you can expose to the other data products. It can be SQL endpoints that you can expose, right? So, but the thing is, you have the ingestion from the data stores. You have the integration team to populate your data product. You transform, you nurture, you enrich, you serve data to the rest of the business, and you have the ability to communicate that with the other parts of the business and share and exchange data from there, right? So from a technology perspective, this concept works really well because you're working with a harmonized collection of services that are known to talk to each other really, really well. So as long as you have the right networking connectivity between them, you'll be able to exchange data between them, right? There you go. I think I mentioned this before in terms of how it's a bit of a duplicate slide, but that's the workflow that we have in terms of the workflow of approval to create a new data landing zone, right? Someone makes a callback, they have a notification, we have the trigger of the pipeline to create the ARM templates and deploy with the right policies in place that will ensure that compliance and security are spot on and cannot be broken, right? So that's how you enable. IT takes care of the platform as a whole, takes care of the compliance and the enforcement of these compliance and security requirements, right? But they delegate the power of the development to the business, knowing that they can only do what's going to be allowed by the security policies, right? That's the most important concept here to absorb. Right, and finally, in terms of speaking of security and policies, you can, because these are all infrastructure as a code and these are templates, for example, we have made the recommendation in terms of, okay, what it means to have sensitive information in a landing zone. Do you need a different set of policies between landing zones that have, let's say, non-sensitive data versus sensitive data, right? You can customize that. You can be more relaxed for data, for example, that you're going to share publicly, let's put it that way, versus data that contains highly confidential business critical information or even PII information around privacy in terms of how that can be governed and secured, right? So the concept of Azure policies, it acts as a baseline. So a policy in Azure is a condition that you put in place on the configuration of services, the creation and configuration of services. You can prevent services from being provisioned in the first place. You can say, as I mentioned before, I'd say, in a data lane zone, you cannot have any public IP addresses. So no one will be able to create public IP addresses because there's a policy that enforces that, right? And also the configuration of existing services. For example, you can say through a policy that containers on a storage account cannot be made public, right? You can only have private containers, never public containers, right? That's another configuration that you can enforce through policies. So once you have the policy in place, you can let go of the freedom of creating resources and delegate that to the business, but knowing that they won't be able to do anything that the policy that's going to break the policies, right? So networking integration with enterprise scale. The enterprise scale analytics works on a hub and spoke networking topology. If you go to the networking architecture of the enterprise scale analytics, you see that every data product has a VNet peering to the data management subscription. And also, if you need connectivity back to on-prem, it has a link also to the hub network, right? From there, the hub network will be able to route the traffic back to on-prem if you need access to on-prem sources, or even to the internet if you need access to other SaaS services that live outside your environment. You have the ability to go out from there, from that hub network. So pay kind of close attention to the topology. And of course, take into consideration all of the native security features that we have available inside Azure through Security Center and also embedded in each service. Things like, for example, the advanced threat protection. Advanced threat protection, when you turn it on, you get things like, hey, I've just seen a logging from someone on a different region of the world that's not kind of the usual type of logging, or someone just had a logging here and now they're trying to have a logging in a different place, right? So I just noticed that someone is trying to do a SQL injection attack on your SQL database. All of these alerts give you a chance to respond to these threats in a more timely fashion and keep your environment secure. So just make sure that you enable these capabilities, right? In terms of permissions and security, right? So a common ask is, hey, how do I manage permissions for my reports? How do I manage permission for my SQL environment, for my data lake? It's too many people. How do I actually group permissions together so I can actually becomes easy to manage, right? So this slide shows kind of a very nice way of doing that, which is through the use of Azure AD and Entitlement Management. Right? So if you've never heard of Entitlement Management before, check it out. But what it is attached to the physical layer, right? So let me start here from the left-hand side. The physical layer, you have your data assets, right? So data lakes, databases, reports. And you have on the next column, security groups, Azure AD groups that represent the types of permissions that you can have in these assets, right? For example, for the data lake folders, for example, you have a read group and a read-write group, right? And what you do is, based on the functions that people play in the business, you can group these AD groups together into an access package. And that's exactly what Azure AD Entitlement Management allows you to do, is to create these access packages, which is a kind of a combo of multiple of these groups that users can request, hey, I work in the finance department, so I would like to, I'm a finance analyst, so can I please have access to all of the data assets that I'm allowed to have, right? So through one request, and here you can put a workflow in place in terms of approval or not approval, the individual will be added to all of these groups that are part of the access package, right? So it becomes easier for people to manage permission to these access resources. So check it out, Azure AD Entitlement Management, because that's going to simplify the way you manage security of your environment, right? there you go. That's a kind of a more detailed slide on how you configure Azure in the entitlement management. So just conscious of time, I want to leave some time for questions. Please visit the documentation around the security aspects of enterprise scale landing zones, and this description and this diagram will be there with all the instructions in terms of how to do that. But that's a lot of content that to cover in a short period of time. Actually, I did pretty well. I did it in 50 minutes. But a call to action for you is please go and visit the documentation for enterprise scale analytics. Right, we are improving on a daily basis the number of artifacts and the level of documentation that we make available there. We just had a release just a couple of days ago of our 1.1 version of the documentation with even more guidance around enterprise scale analytics. But look, if you're looking into implementing your Azure environment to allow your analytics workloads to scale and empower your business to do things by their own and harvest the agility of the cloud while maintaining compliance and security under control, highly recommend that you go through this documentation to see exactly how that works. So guys, that's the content that I wanted to cover with you today. I would leave the next 5 minutes for questions if you have any. Sarah, any questions coming from the audience?
Thanks, Fabio. We haven't had any questions come through yet, but we've just put a reminder in there to say if anyone did have any questions regarding your presentation. Just a reminder, just whilst we wait, if anything does come through, to go to that check-in link with the event code 14557, where you'll be able to actually access that call to action link and any other links that Fabio's provided today in his presentation. They'll all be available there. And if you have time to fill out the survey, it's just with that same event code. And I've also put into that comment section a link to our upcoming Sydney events on the meetup page, which you can also go to our Global Reactor page for any other events around the globe and in Sydney. We've also got the YouTube channel there. So a reminder, if there's anything that you've missed from today's session and you need to reference back, there is the on-demand version available straight away on our YouTube channel. The link is just there. Jamie just said, thanks, Fabio. It was a great session. So thanks for tuning in, Jamie. Thank you to everyone else for tuning in as well, wherever you were in the world. Have a good rest of your afternoon, evening, or morning. It appears, Fabio, that you've answered. Oh, no, we do. Just in the nick of time. Thank you for your question, Michael. We'll just put that one up on the screen there. So did you want to read that one?
Right. Okay, so you mentioned 80% prescribed approach with 20% customized. Have you worked with customers who have applied this, and what benefits do they see compared to taking their own path? Very good question. Very good question. Yes, yeah, we have already implemented enterprise scale analytics to a number of organizations here in Australia and also overseas. And what we see exactly the benefits of that approach is the agility that was promised with cloud, right? The problem statement that we had before we implemented the architecture was that they had a centralized cloud services, cloud operations team, right? And that was, for example, that was the outcome of how they started their cloud journey in a more organic way. So they kind of centralized the entire cloud power on a handful of individuals, and everything that needed to be done in the cloud needed to go through these 5 individuals, right? And that created a bottleneck to the business because there's a whole bunch of different business entities kind of willing to use cloud for their initiatives, but suddenly you have a people and process bottleneck. It's not so much technology, it's a people and process bottleneck. And they've reached out saying, please help us. How can we reorganize ourselves in a way that we can, again, empower the business, but keep security tight and compliance in place? When we start actually going through the enterprise scale landing zones, we investigated, for example, the different teams in the business that could play a role in the cloud that before have been kind of marginalized. So those 5 individuals kind of held all the power, but now actually say, hey, this function that sits with you should be with a different team, maybe networking team, that security team, right? And now they saw themselves actually kind of delegating more of these functions to different areas, and now they get together more often in a way to advance the cloud journey, because they're all in it together now. They're all trying to make things better. So to answer the question in terms of the templates, in terms of 80% versus 20%, there will always be the 20% required for specific things that are related to every business, but be sure that 80% works for the Pareto rule here, right? So most of your most common requirements for enterprise analytics, and we discussed those 7 requirement pillars, have already been implemented as part of the templates. So how to use the cloud adoption framework when the customer is already have a cloud vendor and they would like to move to the Azure data platform. Very good question. Very good question. Look, the cloud adoption framework is general guidance to do cloud in general, right? So the principles that we have in the cloud adoption framework are very much cloud agnostic, let's put it that way. It's all about guidance and principles. When you go to if you have, for example, another cloud vendor, if you have AWS, for example, or GCP, or any other cloud provider that sits out there, right? And you want to bring to the data platform, the principles of cloud adoption are similar between cloud platforms. Because as the name implies, this is a cloud adoption framework, not an Azure adoption framework, right? The principles are the same. They translate really well from where you're coming to where you're going, which is the Azure data platform. You find that the guidance through CAF and the enterprise scale analytics, they still talk about performance optimization and operational excellence. And I'm sure that all of these concepts are also valid from the other cloud providers as well. So I believe you won't have any difficulty to translate these concepts as you bring your workloads to the Azure data platform. Good, exactly. I think it's great. It's good to see that pillars of people, process, and technology work together, still seen as essential. That is absolutely true, right? Even more so in this topic of data management, it is a hot topic at the moment. We're talking about data governance, right? Data governance is a classic example where, let's use the Pareto rule again, 80% of the problems related to data governance are actually people and process. And only 20% is actually technology, right? Tools like Azure Purview, Colibra, for master data management, for example, with Prophecy or Cloudin, they help, right? They help you do data governance, but they won't enforce data governance by themselves. You need the right people with the right knowledge and the right executive support, very, very important. Executive support from someone that understands the value of data and the value of organizing the teams around harvesting the value of data. That is important, right? So people and process, don't forget, very important. Technology will always there to support people and process.
Great, thanks, Fabio. So thank you to everybody for your questions that just came through, and thank you again for tuning in. Just a reminder that that's a check-in link there with the additional links. So we're bang on time now, so thank you again so much, Fabio, for joining us today for a really great, engaging presentation. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. Have a good rest of your afternoon, evening, or morning, and we'll see you next time for another Microsoft Reactor live stream event.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.